Hello, everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade. I am Director of Social Science Matrix, and I am very pleased to welcome you today to a Matrix on-point panel on the rights and lives of non-citizens. And we are presenting this panel in partnership with the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, or BIMI. This panel will consider forms of non-citizenship and marginalization around the world. And I know that our panelists are also around the world, and I'm sure our audience too. And we will have a special focus on refugees, stateless people, and undocumented migrants. Now, for those of you who are new to Social Science Matrix, we are a cross-disciplinary social science research institute at UC Berkeley. And today's event is part of our Matrix on Point series. It's a series that is devoted to panel discussions on important matters of the moment. Now, let me just mention a few upcoming events. Next Tuesday, November 2nd, we have a virtual panel on religion in the age of information. That's a panel joined with the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. On November 10, we have another virtual panel on the labor of firefighting. And on November 16, we have an Author Meets Critics event with Sai Balakrishnan, Assistant Professor of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. Now you can check our website for further details. And now, let me introduce the moderator of today's panel. Irene Bloemraad is the founding, welcome Irene, is the founding director of Berkeley's Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative and the class of 1951 professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Irene studies how migrants become incorporated into the political communities where they live and the consequences of migration for politics and understandings of membership. Her research has been published in academic journals spanning sociology, political science, history, and ethnic and migration studies. And she has authored or co-edited 5 books, including the Oxford Handbook of Citizenship, Rallying for Immigrant Rights, and Becoming a Citizen. The International Migration Review named Bloemraad its featured scholar of 2018. In 2014-2015, she served as a member of the US National Academy of Sciences panel reporting on the integration of immigrants into US society. So without further ado, Irene, I turn over to you. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this event. I want to thank Matrix for organizing the event and for inviting the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative to join. I would welcome all of you, if you don't yet know about BIMI, as we affectionately call the Berkeley International Migration Initiative, to visit our website. We have lots of different resources for those of you who might teach migration. We have videos on migration research methods, including a video that features one of our speakers today. And we have slide decks in terms of information about migrants. And we also have a number of policy briefs that bring the academic research of Berkeley faculty into sort of more understandable content for a general audience. And so I would also encourage you to check out our policy brief series. So today it's really a pleasure to be speaking with such an international and globalist looking group of scholars, people who think big picture in terms of changes and phenomenon across the globe, but then also at times drill down into how this is affecting local lives. And for those of you listening in, I was reflecting before I came online that in fact, all of us are non-citizens. And in fact, all of us are non-citizens in most places in the world. And I was thinking that when I was looking at the title, because when we see the title like non-citizenship, I think we do often have in our mind a picture of migrants in boats or people trekking long distances, trying to find a better place. And of course, that is going to be the topic of our conversation. But the concept of non-citizenship actually applies to every single human living on the globe, because citizenship is what sort of gives us a membership status on one particular territory, but excludes us from basically the vast majority of other territories in the world. Now, for most people in the world, it doesn't really matter that you're a non-citizen almost everywhere, because most people are living in their country of citizenship. And in fact, probably somewhere over 95% of people in the world live in the country where they hold citizenship. But of course, citizenship doesn't give you the same thing depending on where you live. So if you're living in a democratic, richer country, that security of territory in place can give you access to the rule of law, to a good school system, to good healthcare, to a chance of prosperity. Whereas if your citizenship is located in other places in the world, then your life might be shaped by violence, by poverty, by a lack of freedom, either for many people in your country or for particular groups in a country that are targeted because of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their religion, a host of different factors that might mean that your citizenship does not provide you with very much protection. And in those cases, people might leave, they might migrate. And as soon as you migrate, as soon as you cross that international border, you then become a non-citizen in the place that you live. Now, non-citizenship can also affect people even if they don't cross international borders. Probably, as many of you know, the birthright citizenship that we have in the United States is actually an anomaly outside of the Western Hemisphere. So in most places, you do not gain citizenship in the place you're born automatically. And so people are born every day who do not have the citizenship of the place that they live. And if the place that their parents held citizenship do not, for one reason or another, transfer that citizenship to the child, well, then that child actually becomes stateless. People can also become stateless when political entities change, they fragment, they transform, and people can find themselves no longer with the security of citizenship. These are some of the issues we're going to be talking today as we consider citizenship, looking at migrants, asylum seekers, undocumented people, the stateless, and we have an absolutely brilliant panel to talk through this. The panel shared sort of some of their main ideas before we came online today. And so the order that we're going to be speaking is slightly different from what you will have seen on the website. What we're going to do is we're going to have one speaker talk about some of the bigger global, legal, and philosophical issues, and then we're going to have a second speaker who brings that down to some of the tensions and issues on the ground. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak. So rather than introduce the entire panel, I'm going to do it before each speaker speaks so that we can have the bio of the speaker together with their remarks. And I also just want to let you know that I'm going to be giving a short little bio, and all of our speakers have done some really amazing work and have some absolutely, fascinating publications. And so I'd encourage you to go to the Matrix website to learn more about some of those publications. So without further ado, to start us off, it is my great pleasure to introduce Itamar Mann, who I believe is joining us from many time zones away out in Israel, I believe, yes. Dr. Mann's research and teaching interests are in international law, especially at the intersections with refugee and migration law, environmental law, and legal theory. A large part of Dr. Mann's research focuses on legal, political, and ethical questions that arise from large-scale migration. His book, Humanity at Sea, Maritime Migration and the Foundations of International Law, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2019. Dr. Mann, I'm going to hand over the virtual podium to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me. This is a real pleasure to be with many people whose work I've encountered along the way, and with a list of names of listeners in various places. I'm really delighted. I'd like to start my talk today with an anecdote, which is a moment that occurred when I was with Human Rights Watch back in 2009 in research on the Greek-Turkish border, the land border in the Evros region. it was a early morning hour, and we were driving the car looking for people to interview. And along the way, we saw a group of 3 people, 2 men and a woman, dressed in the woman was with a headscarf, and the men were in pants that suggested that they were Somali. That was what the more senior researcher told me when we saw them. And we stopped by, and immediately it seemed very unlikely that they were indeed Somali. And later that day, when we visited a certain detention center, it became apparent that they're actually from the Dominican Republic and had traveled all the way to Turkey and crossed the border to Greece dressed as Somalis. So this was a very, very curious moment that led me to some thinking around citizenship and around what it means to be human, or the category of humanity as it has been constructed in international law, as well as in a certain political, cultural imagination that comes with international law, that kind of feeds international law. And to explain this very curious encounter and how important I think it is, how large scale what it represents is in what we talk about today when we talk about unauthorized migration, I want to start with insights that are often ascribed to Hannah Arendt, and this idea that the citizenship, or rather political community, is the single basis for rights. And observing multiple refugee crises in the interwar period, Arendt also thought that humanity, or the promise of the rights of man, was really just a kind of illusion, and will often just evaporate in the face of real danger and emergency when states turn to sovereign power and close their borders. So the right to have rights, or the rights of membership, are really the only basis for protection. And what I want to tell you today, coming out of the story that I started with, and I will return to this as I proceed, is that when we look at today's world, it's very clear that that is not the case, and that citizenship in many cases is predatory and has turned into a kind of anti-membership, if you will. And on the other hand, the rights of humanity, the rights of the human rights, have become really quite important for a particular segment of the planet's population. Now, this may sound like a kind of aspirational, cosmopolitan ideal, even perhaps utopian, but the story I will talk about is not necessarily a good one, as will become clear. So after World War II, in the decolonization period, with the project of world making, as it's sometimes referred to, there was this idea that citizenship will be the source of protection the world over. And with the rise of many governments into the UN system, there was also a call for sovereign equality and global redistribution that would come with that, and that would allow a certain backing to this promise of citizenship, not only for European countries, but also for the countries that Arendt at her time referred to as the places of savages. And indeed, this laid the groundwork with a number of important principles of international law. At the same time as citizenship became recognized as a source for rights, the idea of human rights was also that every country has obligations towards whoever is in its territory. And that established the idea of jurisdiction. So we have a puzzle around the world with authority for every country, and every country has its borders, and every country has obligations towards whoever is inside it. And so the entire world will have theoretically such protections. However, as we all, I think, know, the story didn't really work out that way, primarily for the reason of failed global redistribution. And so the promise that some countries gave, as Irene already, I think, mentioned in her introductory comments, became a very weak one. And at the same time, there was a kind of rise when we move into the 70s of the discourse of individual rights, human rights, primarily focused on a limited number of preemptory norms, oftentimes identified by the prohibition of torture, as well as a number of others, but torture is kind of important in this context, that really constructed the human body as something that brings protections, that has protections per se. With its own movement, it kind of takes those very minimal protections with it, and theoretically, it can move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and switch the authority that has the corresponding duty to their right against these very horrendous forms of treatment. And so with the end of the Cold War, when migration became really more and more about movement from the global South to the global North and less about the Iron Curtain, these processes start to lead to this inversion of the Arendtian picture that I want to convince you today that has occurred, because this structure of jurisdiction, as I said, created certain obligations towards populations that moved. But at the same time, both bilateral and multilateral agreements created a new technology for states to turn certain citizenships and certain categories of humans into deportable by way of a kind of bureaucratic process that will attach them to a certain country that consents to accept them. This is oftentimes called the safe third country concept. It has appeared in that title also during the Trump era in the United States. And it is, I think, quite familiar in the United States more generally, but there's a very thick, what I think is less understood is that there is a very thick network of agreements spanning really the entire fault lines between the global North and the global South, creating this ability to cabin people in countries that are not their own, and use citizenship as a kind of proxy that will allow this joining of a person to a certain part of the puzzle that they may be surprised to land in. So we have here a kind of case where citizenship cabins a person in a particular place, and humanity allows them very minimal claims. Now, going back to the story that I started with, it becomes, I think, more clear what has happened here. The people that were moving, these Dominicans, do not have protections for their claims of humanity, or they didn't think so, perhaps, and wanted to use something else. And so the costume, the masquerading gesture as Somalis is not merely happenstance. It refers back to a certain understanding of what it means to be human. So alongside this kind of prohibition of torture, we have collective protection for certain groups. And these groups are imagined as the absolute victims. They are subject to atrocity, or they come from places where there's no practical way of returning people to those places. And so this becomes the kind of coveted identity and a kind of protection for humans that try very hard to shed their citizenship, because the citizenship becomes really a source of risk. And in this context, we see practices like in the UK, there's a long discussion about the possibility, not clear that it really happened, but of self-infliction of torture by proxy. So in particular, certain categories of asylum seekers from South Asia have been said to try to mark themselves with signs of torture in order to be able to enjoy the protections against those who, for those who are in risk of torture, and not be returned to situations where they suffer very, very harsh conditions, but not such conditions that are recognized as part of this protected humanity. So a person can prefer to be tortured for a short time and not be returned to dire poverty, even though international law tells us that torture is something that should never be and can never be tolerated. So this I think, switch is very interesting, and it relates to the story that I told you about. Now, just as a last kind of suggestion that I want to give in this talk is that this process has created certain pressures. The more certain citizenships become cabins to capture people in, the more people want to get out and use this category of humanity. But when, for example, European states confront this claim repeatedly, they further contract their protections for this category of people. Now, does this hark back to the story that Arendt told us? I don't really think so, because the missing part in Arendt's story is the way that the citizenship then again is reinforced as a form of capture and prevention of movement. And these two processes have a mutual effect, and in the current moment, a kind of, I think, a rather negative dialectical effect. So I know these comments are somewhat dire, perhaps, but I'll leave it with that, with hopes for conversation surrounding it, and hopefully it also sets the stage for interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I loved the optimism, even as your story was heartrending. We are now going to move to Cecilia Menjívar. Professor Menjívar holds the Dorothy L. Meier Social Equities Chair and is professor of sociology at UCLA. She specializes in immigration, gender, family dynamics, the study of social networks, and broad conceptualizations of violence. Her research explores the impact of immigration laws and enforcement on immigrants and the effects of multi-sided violence on individuals, especially Central American migrants. She has an impressive list of publications, and I would direct you to the Matrix website for a fuller overview. I'm also proud to say that she was elected president of the American Sociological Association in 2020. And so we are absolutely delighted to have Cecilia talk to us today. I'm going to hand over the virtual podium to you.
Thank you, Irene, for that warm introduction, and also for the invitation to share my thoughts on this very important topic here with all of you. I am going to, as you will notice, my remarks are very complementary to what Itamar just said in many ways and many points. So I'm very happy that I'm already seeing overlaps on interesting points on this topic. I will focus my remarks on the case of the United States, because that's what takes up most of my energy in my research. But you will see that what I have to say applies very much to the rest of the world, to the rest of the countries that have become immigrant receiving countries today. And so I will give you specific examples of the United States, but keep in mind that this is actually one example of what we see out of a much broader trend around the world that my colleagues will also speak to. So starting with the United States, to be sure, US law doesn't give everyone the right to enter the country. That is something that the federal government in the United States decides. They decide who's allowed to enter, how many people will enter every year, and under what circumstances. Excuse me. But once in the United States, the US Constitution guarantees rights to everyone who is in the country, to immigrants, and I will say even to undocumented immigrants. And the reason why I underscore that is because there's a myth out there that undocumented immigrants have no rights, and that is simply not true. They have rights, constitutional rights, that are extended to citizens by birth in the United States, to citizens by naturalization in the United States. But there is that misconception. So once in the United States, immigrants have a right that includes rights to protection from discrimination based on race and national origin, excuse me, freedom of speech and religion, right to privacy, to worship as they wish, protection from arbitrary mistreatment, excuse me, to express themselves, to free speech, and other rights that citizens, US citizens by birth, also enjoy. Immigrants also have labor rights, and this is often misunderstood, including the right to receiving fair wages for the work they perform and to have a healthy and safe work environment. They also have a right to K through 12 education. So these are rights that are, and then of course, specifically for immigrants who are in insecure legal statuses, when apprehended, for instance, undocumented immigrants have a right to a hearing before a judge, to legal representation, to a prompt, fair trial by a jury, to protection against unlawful search and seizure, and against self-incrimination, and to file a lawsuit. So they have all these rights that very often the public and the immigrants themselves may not be aware of. But a paradox, a tension emerges between what is inscribed in the US Constitution, and some of these are universal rights, on the one hand, and US immigration law. Because US immigration laws and policies that have continued to criminalize immigrants have opened the door for the mistreatment and violation of rights for immigrants. And thus, I would argue that US immigration laws and policies conflict with constitutional and universal rights that immigrants should have. Even though there are rights by virtue of living on US soil, and those rights are guaranteed, then immigration law leaves immigrants unprotected, marginalized, and vulnerable to multiple rights abuses, labor laws, all, you name it, labor violations, the list is long, which activates a number of court cases for violations of rights against immigrants, because those are rights that are inscribed in the Constitution and are protected. And so what happens is with not only US immigration law, but other policies that have been passed that leave immigrants without a right to healthcare, without a right to housing subsidies, without a right to dignified work, or just simply without the right to live without fear and with their families. This is a universal right that is violated every single day in the United States against immigrants who are separated from their families. So we have this tension that gives rights to court cases, gives rights to and put this tension very visibly in the public light. So what happened with this tension is that the legal status today has been elevated to count for much more, because so much hinges on so many rights hinge on legal status today, but it also has become much more difficult to obtain. So on the one hand, we have the tension that I just mentioned, but also the elevation of legal status to accessing rights. And the problem here is that immigration law, again, creates yet another layer of complications here. Because whereas it is against the law to discriminate on the basis of formally discrimination, on the basis of national origin, sex, religious affiliation, race, and family status, current immigration policies and laws actually require discriminatory treatment on the basis of legal status. On the basis of legal status, people can be denied a range of rights, a range of goods and services. So laws that limit or cut off immigrants from accessing decent jobs, housing, healthcare, even due process based on legal status end up violating immigrants' rights to equality of treatment, which is inscribed in the US Constitution. And this is something that we don't usually talk about, but I think it is fundamental to bring up when we're having a discussion about rights of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants specifically. So for instance, just an example, the ACA, the CARE Act of 2010 specifically excludes undocumented immigrants from the right to health care. English-only laws undermine the right to free expression. Other laws, for instance, pro-war in the United States, similar laws cut off or limit access to housing subsidies. And all of these are just examples, brief examples of how US immigration law with other social policies combined to undermine these basic rights that immigrants should have. And therefore their rights are violated in different contexts and across different spheres of life. That is the formal tension that comes from laws and policies. But I also want to mention what happens at the social context, and how the rights of immigrants may be understood or misunderstood in the social context. Because there is an important social component here. What Flores and Schachter described as social illegality. These are the public perceptions, prejudice, racism, and discrimination that go hand in hand, sustain the formal laws that I just mentioned that exclude immigrants. But that on the ground, among the public, create a perception that immigrants should not be here, and if they're here, should not have rights like everyone else. So these are common understandings of the law that have a very consequential effect for immigrants' lives. Based again on constitutional rights, immigrants should not be denied equal opportunity based on their nationality or because their name or accent associates them with a particular national group, or because they are not English proficient, or because they practice customs associated with a national origin group that is unwanted, or because they are married to or associated with people of a certain national origin. However, these social markers equate immigrants, undocumented immigrants, but all immigrants actually, from particular groups, for instance, Latinos, with groups that are criminalized and despised in public discourse and in media portrayals. and are often portrayed as threats. And so in the minds of the public, they start to become people who should not be here, and that has consequential effects for the lives of immigrants. But what's interesting here is that even in these discussions, in these public narratives, we hear the language of rights being used against in the course of arguing for the denial of rights to immigrants. They should not have the right to this, or they should not have a right to dignified jobs. They should not have a right to this. And usually these narratives are framed in very racist and xenophobic and anti-immigrant sentiment. So these social markers, when associated with an unwanted immigrant group, activate instances in which immigrants' rights, those that are universal and constitutional, are violated every day. Very quickly, I'm going to mention also something very, very important here. Media framing of immigrants is key in shaping how the public perceives immigrants, and they become very powerful because they cement in the public's mind the idea that immigrants are criminals or unwanted, or the negative narratives of immigrants, and again that they don't have rights, that they should not have rights because of these social associations that are made. And so media frames provide a lens for the public to see and interpret the world. And when these frames evoke hatred and fear and xenophobia, these narratives trample the rights of immigrants. Framings of migration as a crisis, as a problem to be solved, very often translate into seeing immigrants as a problem, not immigration, but immigrants themselves as a problem. And this, of course, has an effect on how immigrants are treated, how in everyday life, how immigrants are perceived as workers, as parents, as students in their everyday lives. So all of these, of course, has clear and direct effects on immigrants and how they see themselves in US society. On the one hand, immigrants start to believe themselves that they have no rights. There was a case of a Guatemalan Mayan immigrant in the raid in Postville, Iowa, who, when he was taken to court in shackles in front of the judge because he was caught in a raid, he explained to the judge that they could do whatever they wanted with him because he was no one and had no rights. And so this is a very dangerous moment, because when people start to think of themselves as being no one, as having no rights, as not having the right even to exist here, that again has many negative consequences for not only for the individuals, of course, but for communities as a whole. And at the same time, these narratives, what the public sees, what the public consumes, what the formal side composed of laws and policies also activates responses on the part of immigrants who start to organize and to protest and to demand the rights that they have as human beings, as workers, as parents, as students. And so at the same time, it sparks, of course, reactions and demands for rights in a way that it's again is couched in the same with the same narrative of rights. I will end there because I see Irene is back, and so my time should be up. And I welcome and look forward to our conversation at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I just want to remind everyone that we are holding our questions to the end after all of our panelists have spoken, especially for those of you who might have joined us in the last half hour. But you're welcome to writing questions in advance, but please use that question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All right, we are now going to move to Serena Parekh. Dr. Parekh is a professor of philosophy at Northeastern University in Boston, where she is the director of the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program, and also the co-editor of the journal Feminist Philosophy Quarterly. Her primary philosophical interests are in social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and continental philosophy. She is the author of 3 books, and including most recently, published in 2020 from Oxford University Press, No Refuge, Ethics and the Global Refugee Crisis. Serena, I am going to hand the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that great introduction and your introductory remarks, Irene. Thanks to Marion for inviting me and to putting together this really great panel. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. So my own work focuses more specifically on refugees rather than the topic of citizenship more broadly. So I'm going to give you today what I think of as a helpful way to think about the rights of refugees as a group of non-citizens. Of course, they are citizens in their home countries, but by definition, they would have left their home countries for a whole host of reasons because they believe largely that they cannot stay there any longer. What I want to do is just complicate the way the global refugee crisis is sometimes explained to people. We sometimes think that the global refugee crisis is a matter of a crisis for those of us in Western countries who have sovereign states. We aim to protect our sovereignty by imposing limitations on immigration, setting refugee quotas, etc. And the crisis is of people who are uninvited and unwanted coming to our shores, asking for resources and for help and for protection, etc. But I want to turn that on its head a little bit and to suggest instead that there's actually a second crisis, and in fact, a crisis that's much deeper than the one I just mentioned, for refugees themselves. And what I mean by this is not merely the crisis that they've had to flee their home countries in order to seek security and protection and so forth, but that in doing so, they are unable to access the minimum conditions of human dignity, regardless of where they find themselves in the world. So how did this come about? So let me back up a little bit. In the 50s, in 1951, when the UN Refugee Convention was first written, the idea was that if you were a refugee, a person who was fleeing persecution and had crossed a border and seek international protection, you should have one of 3 options. You should be able to return home when you feel the time is safe, it's voluntary return. You should be able to just be integrated into the country you find yourself in. So you cross a border, you find yourself in a neighboring country. And if you have to stay there, then over time you would access rights and you'd be able to integrate. And the third option was that you'd be resettled in a third country, say the United States or Canada or the European Union or whichever other country is willing to resettle you. So had that been the possibilities for refugees, the world would be a very different place today. But in fact, in the 21st century, the reality of the durable solutions is that they effectively don't exist. So in a good year, the highest number of refugees that have ever been resettled since the resettlement regime, as they sometimes call it, has been in place, is about 1%. About 85% are hosted in developing countries, which is to say they are not officially or legally integrated into the country. They are allowed to stay either in refugee camps or informally in urban centers, but don't have many human rights. In the way that our last speaker articulated about immigrants in the United States, is they feel that they don't have rights, and in many cases genuinely don't have any rights. only about 2% of refugees are able to voluntarily return home in a given year. And all this is complicated by the reality that if you are a refugee in the 21st century, you are likely to be a refugee, to remain a refugee for somewhere between 17 and 25 years, again, on average. So all of this, if you put it together, is what I think of as a structural injustice, insofar as refugees aren't able to access the minimum conditions of human dignity. But framing it like this, I think, helps us to reconfigure and reimagine the role of responsibility that Western states have played in this. Let me just briefly say a little bit more about this outcome, which I call the problem that we have created, which is that each of the options we've provided to refugees fails to provide the minimum conditions of human dignity. So as I mentioned, there are three options. The first option is refugee camps, which is about where half of refugees around the world go when they first cross a border in order to seek help. In some ways, refugee camps are great in the aftermath of conflict. They're able to provide security, food, water, in some cases, opportunities for children. But we ask a lot of refugees who enter refugee camps to live there. They need to give up their autonomy. They're not free to come and go or to live where they want in camps, so they have very little freedom of movement. Importantly, they're not allowed to work, so they have to remain dependent on the international community or sort of work in the black market under the table. And while food is provided, it's often very meager. And just to add to that, there's a tremendous amount of gender-based violence and other kinds of insecurity, forms of physical insecurity in camps. About half of refugees now choose not to go to refugee camps and move instead to urban settlements, in particular cities in countries that are peripheral to the country they might be fleeing from. And in a way, they prefer this option because you maintain your autonomy, you maintain your freedom of movement, you're able to come and go as you please, work informally, live with family and friends or co-nationals. But only 1 in 10 refugee receives any kind of aid. And the outcome is that work is extremely precarious, refugees are often in debt, housing is bad to atrocious. And refugee children, even children who might have been living there for years and years, have very little access to education. Given these two options, it'll be perhaps less surprising that we've seen in the last 10 years an increase in the number of people seeking asylum in countries like the United States and the European Union. And this is despite the increase in deterrence policies that have been put in place by those same countries to try to physically prevent refugees from setting foot into their territory, where once they do have a set of rights and entitlements, the biggest of which is that they are they cannot be sent back to their home country if they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And what it means in practice is that people end up being allowed to stay for years without being deported. And even though they might not have an official legal citizenship, they feel like it's a better option than staying where they were. But this also doesn't provide the basic level of human dignity, because in order to seek asylum, precisely because of the deterrence policies that have been put in place, refugees often need to risk their physical safety as well as, in many cases, their lives. Using a human smuggler is virtually required in many circumstances because it's so hard to navigate the path from where you'd be traveling through to get to a country where you could seek asylum. And of course, smugglers, while many refugees see them as offering a service, it can be a very, very brutal, dangerous business. So if you take all these three options together, the conclusion that I want people to be aware of is that for refugees, this is the global refugee crisis. That if you are a refugee, it's very unlikely you will be able to, in fact, get refuge. And not merely for a few years, but for 17 to 25 years. The important thing about this that I want to stress is that this is an injustice that we have created. And by we, I mean citizens and members of wealthy, relatively wealthy democratic states that have supported and put in place many of the policies that have led to this outcome. where fewer than 2% of refugees are actually able to gain refuge in any way. And this is why I think we should understand it as a structural injustice. 2% of refugees have access to any real solutions. The rest are in various forms of the denial of rights and lack of citizenship. Importantly, I don't think this is due to the malicious intentions of any state in particular. Nobody sat around and thought, how can we ensure that refugees are denied their basic human rights? And yet the outcome emerges nonetheless due to various actors acting according to their own interests and based on widely accepted norms and practices, such as border control, limiting immigration, prioritizing security over humanitarian protection, all of which in themselves are maybe unobjectionable. Of course, people do raise objections to them, but in practice create this outcome. And once we see the outcome as a result of our responsibility, a result of what we have created, it really shifts the conversation about responsibility and how we should respond to refugees around the world. Far from it just being a question of should we admit some refugees or not, it really becomes a question of our ethical and moral and political obligations to restructure our system of refugee protection so that refugees are able to access the basic conditions of human rights, basic conditions of human dignity, even if not full citizenship, which of course would be one way of doing that. But even in the absence of that, to think about other ways that refugees might be able to be protected and maintain a level of basic access to rights in this very complicated landscape, politically and morally speaking. So I'm going to stop there, try to keep my remarks to about 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much, Serena. And now we're going to have our final panelist. It is a great pleasure to welcome Noora Lori. Dr. Lori is an assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She studies citizenship, statelessness, temporary migration schemes, and racial hierarchies in comparative perspective. Regionally, her work examines the shifting population movements accompanying state formation in the Persian Gulf, expanding the study of Middle East politics to include historic and new connections with East Africa and the Indian subcontinent. Most recently, she published a prize-winning book, Offshore Citizens, Permanent Temporary Status in the Gulf, through Cambridge University Press in 2019. Noora, the podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction and also for these really thought-provoking comments. It's nice to go last because I get to kind of reflect on what all of the panelists have already said. And I think I'm gonna try to approach this question of citizenship or non-citizenship from the perspective of mobility rights as opposed to membership rights. And so by mobility rights, I mean the authorization to cross borders, as opposed to membership rights, which might be which rights you have within a particular state. And so the key kind of takeaway is that mobility is a citizenship-based right, as opposed to a basic human right. And by that, we have to kind of think about the formation of the nation state system. And here I'm really kind of indebted to John Torpey's work and the invention of the passport, where he talks about, the foundations for sovereignty and the formation of nation states has a lot to do with not just which political entities monopolize authority over legitimate violence, but also monopolize authority over legitimate movement. And when we think of it that way, then we know that your right to cross an international border is deeply structured by which passport you have. And that right is highly stratified globally. And so I think, a lot of theories of IR, with realism, liberalism, constructivism, take the international order as an order of anarchy, but I'm drawn on David Lake's work to think about it as really a system of international hierarchy. And I think passport rankings are really effective way of effective indicator for showing just how hierarchical the global system is in terms of this citizenship-based right of being able to move across borders. And so to kind of bring some empirics into this, we can think about what just happened in Afghanistan. And even prior to the withdrawal and this pressure to be that people face to leave, Afghanistan had one of the weakest passports in the world. So if you had an Afghan passport, you could only travel to 26 countries without pre-authorized, without applying for a visa. So we think of mobility power of a passport as being how many countries can you travel to without requiring that pre-authorization in order to cross borders. So what this means is that you have not only displaced populations or stateless populations or labor migrants who may have partial or temporary kind of membership rights, but they don't have the rights to then cross borders internationally. And to kind of go back to what Itamar was saying about citizenship then becomes a cabin to contain people in or to capture people in. And what Serena was saying about this kind of containment effect of refugees is that we see even for the international human rights framework is limited because you have to show that you've been individually persecuted in order to be durably resettled. But even if you meet this criteria, which most people who are displaced don't, because they may be fleeing generalized violence, inequality, climate change crises, and are not individually persecuted. So even if you meet all of those criteria, there isn't a concomitant right to have a safe passage or humanitarian corridor, which means that, if you're Afghan or you're from another country that has these weak passports, and I mentioned Afghanistan, if you're a German citizen, you can go to 178 countries without pre-authorized entry. So that means in a moment of crisis, really your ability to manage that crisis is highly structured by your country's location within this international global order. And so what we see is this kind of containment effect where some of the people that desperately need safe passage, the only possible way is to engage these human traffickers, become illegal, and take on increasingly dangerous journeys. That means that you cannot actually use the modes of travel that are safe and made for other human beings. So this we're left with this kind of problem of, well, is there a way potentially to create safe passage under duress, to provide for the international community to develop mechanisms for allowing people who are facing particular crises potentially kind of temporary authorization to cross borders if they have these passports that don't actually allow them to do that. One of the key kind of problems with trying to conceptualize that framework is that this ability to enforce borders is seen as a key aspect of modern of state sovereignty, and one that has lasted as this kind of bastion of state sovereignty. And so, how do you convince states to open up their borders for people who need to flee a particular crisis? So on the one hand, this is a bastion of sovereignty, but on the other hand, we actually see citizenship as mobility, as distinct from membership, as being incredibly commodified. And over the past 2 decades in particular, but especially earlier from the 1960s to now, about 20% of the states in the world actually sell their citizenship to high net worth individuals. And so there is a kind of international framework now that's developing around providing mobility rights, but it's not for vulnerable groups. It's for people who have the means to purchase these passports. So I think that I'm going to make some kind of suggestions of how we might bring these two together, the mobility that the high net worth individuals of the world enjoy versus the immobility or containment of vulnerable groups. But I'm going to make these suggestions with a healthy dose of skepticism and hesitation, because I'll be talking a little bit about the role of the private sector and market actors. And we know that these market actors are ultimately much more driven by profit making than any kind of commitment to human rights. Having said that, there are historical precedents to creating kind of special passports for vulnerable groups. I'm thinking here of the Nansen passports that were established, that were regulated through the League of Nations after World War I to help refugees and stateless populations fleeing that war. That was kind of a short-lived experiment. In my book that Irene mentioned, I also look at a more contemporary experiment of providing passports without membership rights that occurred when a private company, the Comoros Gulf Holding, facilitated a deal between the federal government in the UAE and the presidency of the Union of Comoros. That was effectively not necessarily a citizenship by investment scheme, but kind of a citizenship by development scheme, because this started in 2008, but the UAE government funded infrastructural development in the Union of Comoros in exchange for printing passports for stateless populations in the UAE. I think in the book, I look at really the kind of disastrous consequences of this and really see it as a form of kind of codifying statelessness and de facto statelessness, because those individuals then cannot reside in the Union of Comoros and they don't have full membership rights in the UAE, so they've effectively become stateless everywhere. And so again, there's real issues and pitfalls of trying to separate out these elements of citizenship and separate out mobility rights from membership rights. It could lead to systematic precarity and uncertainty and a loss of access to all sorts of rights internally. At the same time, especially thinking about the fact that we're only going to see these crises compound and increase over time, especially with climate change, we should be starting to think creatively about how responses to displaced populations are not just about, housing them and putting them in camps and meeting needs like work authorization or access to healthcare or education in different locations, but also think about this other aspect of citizenship, which is the right to mobility and the right to cross borders. So are there ways of thinking about how to repurpose the existing pathway, the existing system of citizenship by investment schemes into a kind of system for providing mobility to specific groups, vulnerable groups who are facing duress? So this is part of a debate that was hosted by Rainier Bulbach and Jelena Dasnik at the European University Institute, and there's a number of scholars who are kind of reflecting on this question, and I'll post the links to that debate in the chat. But my kind of contribution to that debate was to think about, well, what role can the private sector play, and can we reimagine how these pathways that are set up for high net worth individuals could be repurposed for more vulnerable groups. First, I think we can take, leaving aside, all the problems with the Comoros UAE deal, one thing that we saw emerging there was issuing passports to groups on a kind of collective basis as opposed to individual basis. I think here consent is really important, because in that case, there was no consent. The people who received these passports didn't agree to it. They didn't want them. But you can conceptualize a system in which consent is part of the ability to receive these passports or not. We could tax existing citizenship by investment schemes, specifically on each transaction. The individuals who are purchasing these passports, the states that are selling these passports, and the private companies like Henley Partners or Art and Capital, or vast majority now of not vast majority, excuse me, a very large number of private companies that extract income over this hierarchy in global mobility. They're all making money off of these transactions. We could tax some of those transactions and put some of those funds towards a coffer for providing passports for people who need them. we could ask states to allocate a certain number of the passports that they allocate towards citizenship by investment schemes towards these groups who meet the criteria for the necessity of flight. We could also ask citizenship by investment firms to take a certain number of pro bono cases as a proportion of the total citizenships that they're selling each year. We could repurpose international donor funding. So we know that private companies and also large foundations, Soros Foundation, Gates Foundation, IKEA, are spending a lot of money towards housing and also kind of containing migrants in particular parts of the world. I mean, this is obviously displaced populations have immediate needs when they're located in kind of transit states or sending states. But not all of the money necessarily has to go towards that kind of containment. We could also think about ways of financing things like special passports for vulnerable groups through those existing pathways. Finally, you have these kinds of mobility pacts, which are, I'm thinking specifically of the kinds of mobility pacts that the EU has with migrant sending or transit states, where these have also been kind of critiqued as being effectively immobility pacts, because they're all about financing other governments to prevent migrants from leaving and touching ground, specifically in areas into states like European states or North America that have robust protections for asylum seekers. So one way of kind of preventing people from seeking those protections is to just prevent them from touching ground. And so we see a lot of financing in that direction, and some of that could be repurposed. We also could incorporate, there's lots of debates within the UN and the international community about this migration development nexus, where it's the idea is that you stem migration by funding developmental projects and sending or transit countries. Well, some of that instead could go towards kind of financing special passports for vulnerable groups. And then we could, there's a whole range of trade agreements and other bilateral, multilateral agreements that states already negotiate over. And we could include things like visa waivers or special passage for vulnerable groups into those other existing kinds of agreements. I think one real kind of pushback on any this idea would be, are we devaluing citizenship? To that, I would respond that we're happy to devalue it when it comes to people with deep pockets, right? Another key challenge might be this question of, well, security, how do we vet individuals? And to this, I'll just say that there's an incredible amount of intelligence sharing and security cooperation between states and through private security contractors when it comes to surveillance, tracking, identifying, for example, terrorist suspects. And meanwhile, we have thousands of unaccompanied migrants who just disappear in these crisis situations. And so I think we make really conscious decisions about how to mobilize security resources and who to focus on and who to vet. And those decisions can be changed. And so I'll stop there and just say that I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with the rest of the panelists.
Great, thank you so much, Noora. Let me first note that one of the things that struck me as I was listening to the various panelists was the different language in terms of the reasons why or the claims that can be made by people on others for their own protection. We've talked about human rights. So Itamar talked about human rights. Cecilia mentioned constitutional rights specific to the United States, though many countries around the world would have their own version of constitutional rights. Noora talked about mobility versus membership rights. And then Serena, with one exception, refused to use the word rights, if I got this correctly, and spoke about human dignity. And so one question I would have for the panel is whether looking forward, we should continue to use the language of rights, realizing that rights has been very individualized, at least in sort of its modern versions, and this tension then between the individual claiming or demanding rights, and then also sort of the sense of that brings the law and legal structures into the conversation. And potentially law and legal structures can be extremely conservative. The people who tend to make decisions in the law and legal structures tend to be the ones with power, not the ones with the least amount of power. The second thing I'm just going to raise is I was really struck by Itamar talking at the start about how the regime of human rights was also premised on an idea of global redistribution, that at some point we'd get to the point that perhaps people wouldn't need to migrate. But that is then in juxtaposition to the way that people often understand human rights, which is at the most minimalist level about torture. And I think Noora was getting a little bit at this between the mobility versus membership rights, and then offering provocatively, which I think was really interesting, a market-based solution to some of this. And so I would invite the other panelists to think through, do you think the market is the way out of this issue? If there are problems with rights, if there are problems with legal structures, is the market a possible solution to that? And now I'm going to pose some other questions that we've got. I have one from Marion Fourcade, and she asks, can the panelists discuss how new technologies of identification and tracking, such as biometrics, may be transforming the rights of non-citizens today? I was struck by how Serena was pointing out that refugees will often want to go to urban areas so they can have autonomy, but probably also in a way to no longer be tracked in the way that they would be tracked in refugee camps. So that would be a question from Marion. And then we have two questions from Luma Bashmi. First question is, how can countries in the Arabian Gulf play a more proactive role in supporting refugees and immigrants coming from the Middle East, as in not just integrating them into their own countries, but given the closeness in the borders and the cultures and other aspects? And then a more general question beyond the Middle East from Luma: what have been some of the most effective interventions in integrating vulnerable groups into new territories from a human dignity and perhaps also a mental health perspective? And then I'm thinking here, especially maybe some of Cecilia's work in terms of the life experiences of some of our most vulnerable immigrants, perhaps in the United States. So in the interest of time, I am going to go back to our panel with these questions. And I think I will probably just go back into the order that everybody spoke. And I would ask you all to maybe keep your remarks to about 2 or 3 minutes so we can have everybody have a chance to respond. So we'll start with Itamar.
Okay, excellent. So I don't know if I'll get all the points, but I will get some of them. With regard to the basic question about rights, I think it's absolutely right that many people that speak in the language of rights have different opinions of about what those rights should be, and some of them are very objectionable opinions. But I think our use of rights at some level is strategic, in the sense that we don't want to just give away that fighting field and say, okay, everyone else can have that. We're just going to remove ourselves from there. And in that regard, it feels very difficult as a lawyer. I also do practical lawyering in this field to just say, okay, I'm throwing my hands up. But of course, it shouldn't be dominating the whole vocabulary, and it should be one tool among many instruments of a movement. So that's on one kind of basic level. I think I have more to say about this, but I think I'll leave it there for the interest of time. In terms of market-based solutions, I also thought the suggestions were interesting and provocative. I also heard the note of skepticism within Noora's words. So I just want to say about that we do have a market-based solutions. Some of the solutions are maybe not for the most vulnerable, but for people that are arguably, somewhat vulnerable, including market-based solutions for laborers of various kinds, in terms of temporary visas and protections. So it's something that we do actually have, and it has its limitations, obviously. I wanted to, in my talk, but I forgot to mention a suggestion that a very progressive international lawyer, Alex Alenikoff, has made some years ago, I think in 2012 already, where he said that basically UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, should move to a model where protection is very much integrated into development, and visas are granted on a need basis to countries where refugees can come and offer services that are needed in those countries without the opportunity of integration as a kind of way to bypass the deep entrenchment of refugee conditions in some countries where 17 years, the number that Serena mentioned, is really the lower number. And so, but that does have risks. That has very clear risks in terms of just creating a class of moving workers that are able to kind of change their location according to economic needs, but do not have membership at all. And I think that we're also confronting a situation right now that relates to what I talked about in terms of readmission agreements and third country agreements, that there is a kind of global market for services for hosting refugees, and governments are putting themselves on this market and demanding payment and are developing expertise in this. And it is a kind of trade in human bodies, really, that is developing today, that is also a kind of market that has many, many problems. But Noora's words just reminded me that I think is very important to think about today. In terms of technologies, my own work has touched upon surveillance technologies, the technologies of tracking people from afar via aircraft or drones, especially in the Mediterranean region. And I think this is a really, really important area where in the Mediterranean, the mid-Mediterranean in particular, there's basically an all-encompassing condition of surveillance. So all the movements are tracked by European governments and the EU and Frontex, the Frontex agency. And but in terms of the place where international law is today, these movements are kind of from afar, and they do not trigger jurisdiction. They do not trigger obligations and duties among the governments that are pursuing the surveillance. And so the process that has been called border externalization is perfected without the opportunity to make any claims, all based on preemptory barriers to movement that others have spoken about here as well. And I think this is a very odd situation in terms of the law. And I do think the law, talking about rights and not giving away that arena, needs to be developed so that certain forms of all-encompassing surveillance need to come with certain legal duties attached to them, and with human rights jurisdiction for that regard. One last word about mental health. I just want to give a plug to an organization that I've been slightly involved in as a board member, but has done amazing work on mental health. They're called Humanity Crew. They're Palestinians from my city, Haifa, and they've been providing psychiatric and psychological and other mental health assistance in the Greek islands in Arabic. And that proved extremely important during the height and the aftermath of the so-called 2015 refugee crisis. People coming from Syria and other parts of the Middle East have confronted many groups, many of them criticized perhaps rightly in part for white saviorism, but this group has been able to provide a kind of culturally sensitive form of help that has to do with common roots in one region of Greater Syria that historically is really, one geographic unit. And I think that's something that's generalizable, should be generalizable, it should be given significant thought, also looking to further crises in the future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Itamar. Cecilia.
Very quickly. I agree with Itamar that we should not give up the vocabulary of rights because of the connections that makes possible to the global arena, to universal concerns. At the same time, I do appreciate Serena's point about the dimension of dignity that we have to keep in mind. And so I can't give up the language of rights, even if it's misconstrued, misinterpreted very often, but maybe highlighting the aspect of dignity that we're talking about. And just very quickly with regards to technologies, absolutely, new technologies are changing the way migrants are being surveilled and tracked. I'm doing work on post-detention experiences of asylum seekers in the United States who are placed in so-called alternatives to detention programs, are all surveillance-based, tracking, all sorts of tracking monitors, but we also have that more broadly. So absolutely making a huge transformation in the lives of immigrants and how they experience them every day. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Serena.
Yeah, thank you for those great questions. I'll just focus a little bit on the very first question about human rights. And I do think that the standard we should be aiming for in their treatment of refugees and migrants is this minimum condition of human dignity, because I don't think anyone can deny that this is necessary for human beings. But I don't think we should abandon the language of human rights either. And I use it to argue for however you want to interpret the rights of states to control immigration, it can't be at the expense of human rights. And what we see in a lot of deterrence policies, the Remain in Mexico protocol, things like that they really do violate human rights in a uncontestable way, in a very I know that a lot of the debates around human rights are highly contested, but there's a certain way in which some rights are just obviously violated. And I think that is a really effective way to criticize some of the policies and practices that are put in place around migrants. And at the same time, I want to be really attentive to the ways that they are used to deny migrants and refugees a place within our system. I'm thinking, for example, of the rights of residents to cultural integrity, to security, etc., that are often used to justify, very brutal deterrence policies. And I'm thinking at the same time of the way that the EU, for example, and the US and often as well, uses the language of wanting to protect the human rights of migrants to enforce deterrence policies, the idea that we should prevent them from coming over and taking the dangerous journeys because we care so much about their human rights that we should prevent them from leaving in the first place. And it's to my mind, my eyes, transparently cynical, that use of human rights, because we know that the reason they want to leave is because their human rights are in danger, and forcing them to stay is in fact a violation of their human rights. And yet nonetheless, there's a high road that can be taken when you invoke the language of human rights. And so it's important to, I think, when we hear how human rights are being used, to really interrogate how it's being used, why it's being used. Is it really for the sake of protecting human rights? So that's my very mixed feelings about human rights is the conclusion.
All right, thank you. And Noora.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very provocative question about should we eliminate the use of the language of rights, and it makes me think about how much I critique democracies or just the ways in which democratic states also have a long history of racial hierarchy. And for anyone who's kind of interested in this, Michael Hanford's book Spectre of Race, I think, does a phenomenal job of showing from the earliest foundations of democracy that there were these hierarchies. And but then when pushed, I still don't want to get rid of democracies, right? And I think that's the kind of my response to this question too, is that spending a lot of time critiquing it, I still don't want to eliminate this category. And I think especially because there's something, if anything, we just want to kind of expand and think of better enforcement mechanisms for how to protect those rights instead of eliminating that language, even if the language that we're going to use instead, like dignity, it may be more powerful. There's something about kind of the codification of rights into legal frameworks that I think is really key, even when we have questions of enforcement, implementation, ways of circumventing those obligations. The market solutions, yeah, I mean, I'm the one who suggested them, and I take several steps back, knowing that often market solutions can be some of the worst, have the worst outcomes from human rights. But I'm also trying to move beyond critiquing to think of practical solutions, which I think is really, really difficult and sort of not what we're trained to do. And that kind of connects to Noma's question about what have been some of the most effective integrations and in terms of human dignity. And I think the sort of thinking about mental health is really, really important. And I don't necessarily have a good answer to it, other than thank you for bringing up especially the mental health aspect. I know we're very short on time, so I'll just very quickly say, in response to the surveillance and biometrics and new technologies, there's obviously a risk of putting certain groups under much more surveillance than others, and limiting them and kind of racializing them. On the other hand, I think when you look at something like statelessness, there are real risks to not being enumerated, to not being counted, and that actually leads to not being foreclosing access to a lot of things down the line. And I'm thinking here of tribes within the Arabian Peninsula that were really skeptical of the census takers, because they thought, well, are you going to? Why do you want to know how many children I have? Are you going to put us in the military? There's going to be conscription, but then downstream are now completely stateless because they refused to be enumerated or weren't captured in those censuses. So there's a real tension there, I think, with thinking about these technologies from an identity management perspective. And then finally, on the GCC and what the Gulf states can do, I think we can do a lot more in terms of supporting refugee resettlement, actually, become parties to the International Human Rights Convention. And we can also get our houses in order, because all of the Gulf states, actually most of the Middle East, has patrilineal citizenship regimes, which means women cannot give citizenship to their children, which leads to systematically statelessness. So I think that it's a longer conversation, but thank you, Lama, for bringing up these points, because I think it's a really important one.
Yeah. Thank you, Noora. And it was absolutely a wonderful conversation. I want to thank all of our panelists, and I especially appreciate how we were able to speak about multiple regions in the world, both the countries that are hosting or receiving migrants, and also the places from where they are coming. So I also want to thank our audience. Information about our speakers is on the Matrix website. If you'd like to follow up with anybody who spoke today. Thank you again to Matrix for hosting and organizing this. And we hopefully will see each other sooner rather than later in person. So I wish you all a very good Friday, and we will see each other hopefully soon.
Thank you.